up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. It's been a long time coming, but we're here, and it's time for Red Library's real late-night philosophy hours. Hooah! Our most excellent, beautiful baby, Comrade Commissar of Degeneracy, Alex, is back on, and we're here to talk about sex and a whole lot more. We're here today to read What is Sex? Or I should say, What is Sex? By Alenka Zupancic, the Slovenian psychoanalytic philosopher and theorist extraordinaire. I call her Bae. And as with our other Real Late Night Philosophy Hours series, this one, we're going to stretch out quite a bit. This is going to be the first of two parts, two fairly lengthy parts. And for part one, we're going to focus on the Lacanian psychoanalytic approach that looks at sexuality in opposition to gender, the sort of ontological theoretical implications of focusing on one versus the other as your point of radical emancipatory subjectivity. We're going to talk about class struggle, we're going to talk about democracy, and as you may not be surprised, there's going to be a lot of spicy, icy cold motherfucking takes, a lot of risque jokes, a lot of innuendo, and a lot of diving into the theoretical abyss. And as always, there is no one better I like to do that with than good old Comrade Alex. As this is a long one, we're going to get right into it. Part 2 will be out in 2 weeks after we release our patron-only episode next week, which will be on the Society of the Spectacle as embodied in YouTube food reviews. And we think that one is going to be just complete, raucous, high-energy, high-dialectical energy fun. So remember to support Red Library. Become a patron. Head over to our Patreon page, and for as little as $1 per month or a quarter an episode, you can get access to that one coming up next week, all of our past patron-only episodes, get on our Discord server, come hang out with us. I think we're going to watch a movie as we all socially distance and quarantine ourselves. So, we do fun stuff like that. We're trying to get up to 50 patrons, and we are starting to get so close, finally. Big shout out to all of our new patrons over the last month or so. We see y'all. You are valid. You are loved. You are welcome. If you're listening on iTunes, please subscribe, share the show around, head down and give us one of those starred reviews, whatever one you feel is appropriate. But the only realistic option is 5 stars, or else Comrade Commissar Don will come and find you. I promise you that. Like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and so on and so on and so on. All right, here we go. Diving into the theoretical abyss. Put on those fucking hard hats, buckos. We'll see you back here afterward. Enjoy. Yo, comrades, welcome to the lockdown, the love lockdown, and the Red Library Guerrilla Stronghold. I'm here in cyber-goth attire to protect from COVID-19 with our most excellent Comrade Commissar of Degeneracy.
Hey, it's me, Alex, the barrier of the Troika. You better shoot me in the head and light me on fire before I sniff your daughter.
Woo, coming in hot. Coming in real hot today.
Oh, man, I'm excited. I'm excited about this book we're about to do.
I'm very excited. We've been talking about this book for quite some time. Do you want to go ahead and share with our beautiful babies out there, our beautiful boo-boos, what we're going to be reading today?
Yes. We, today, are going to be reading What is Sex? By Alenka Zupancic. Might seem like an elementary question, but let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it is not.
Yeah, it is perhaps the most complicated question, and is maybe, after reading the book myself, and even though you're going to lead the episode, I've read the book, and so we'll, have a little bit of familiarity with it, but what we're going to find from Zupancic is that, this is maybe the most important question that has just massive, massive implications for all sorts of things, depending on how you answer it, and we're going to be trying to answer it in the Lacanian psychoanalytic framework. Big shocker on that one.
Yeah, well, you know us.
Yeah, you know who it is.
Gang.
gang.
Yeah, so, what is where to even fucking start? So,
maybe as a suggestion of where to start, so would you maybe talk about why we decided to do this book and your familiarity with Zupancic and... yeah, where we're coming at this thing from.
Why did we... well, I think frankly, Zupancic is, I mean, we were just talking about this, one of, if not the most interesting, like, Lacanian writer that I've encountered in, like, quite a long time.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
easily.
like, you know, reading Zizek and, like, whatever other writers that, you know, Badiou and, like, all these other people that we write, even, like, Copjec and stuff. But, I mean, man, Zupancic has a way of, like, just getting in there and just, like, doing it dirty. You know what I'm saying? Just, like, getting straight to the damn point and being like, hello, do you understand this or not? And if you don't, what the fuck are you doing with your life? Understand this.
Yeah.
You know, and like, she just really lays it bare. And it's a concise book. It's like 143 pages.
Yeah.
But like, my God, if there's not a wealth of philosophical insight and information in this book, like it's incredible. I don't know. It's like one of the most packed to the gills, like most interesting books I've read. Short, but packs a punch.
Totally agree. Whenever I read it, I would say that probably about halfway through the book, I was starting to feel this way. And then at the end, I was completely convinced. Easily the best book, or one of the best books I've read in years.
Yeah.
The conciseness of it, the sort of revelatory nature and the shocking places she goes with the analysis is just absolutely astonishing to me. I mean, again, I'm sort of, there's a competition right now for me in terms of Lacanian psychoanalytic theorists, whether it's Zupancic or Mari Rudy, like which one is bae. But again, Zupancic is probably still a little bit higher just because of the way that she writes and her analytical approach, which I think is a little bit more expansive theoretically. I was going to ask too, so Zupancic, she's also Slovenian, is that right?
Slovenian, yeah, she's part of that like troika. It's like Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zupancic and Slavoj Žižek, and they kind of, I know they've worked in conjunction on many different projects, including this one, I think.
Yeah,
I know Žižek wrote the foreword, I believe.
Yeah, I think he's the editor for the series that this is coming out of. So it's published by MIT in 2017, and the series is called Short Circuits, and I think he's the editor for the series.
Good stuff, man. It's just like right down that same psychoanalytic, sociocritique kind of vein, and it's just like super interesting and just like super productive in terms of like philosophical insight. So this book in particular, it's kind of interesting because, you know, the title is What is Sex, right? And you're kind of thinking, okay, this is obviously, you know, it's Freudian, Lacanian, you know, we're going to be talking about the role that sex plays in like the psychoanalytic framework, right? But I think that in common parlance, right, like sex is not something that we think about in this way, right? Like I think most people understand sex to be a category of like biological reproduction, right? Or maybe like set of different orientations, you know, something having to do with like sexuality, or you know, if you're like a really strict biological perspective, maybe you consider sex as like a thing that determines whether you're a man or a woman or something like that, right? But even beyond gender and masculinity versus femininity, I mean, Zupancic shows the way that sex is like cutting straight to the heart of subjectivity itself, and especially with regard to like the Lacanian real, which is something that I guess we will end up discussing here because that actually goes into it quite a bit. So we'll probably have to meet out a little bit what that means for the listeners that don't know about the Lacanian real, and just in general how it relates to her argumentation here.
Yeah, I also want to ask you too, because whenever you're on the show, it's basically part of our ongoing series of real late night philosophy hours.
Oh yeah.
And I was curious for you, thinking about, considering our last episodes, we did one on the entrepreneurial state with Comrade David. We just finished up our Ernest Mandel Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory series. And this might seem like it's coming out of left field. And so I was wondering, like, for you, what do you think is the relevance of our listeners right now, understanding this book or trying to grapple with Zupancic and some of its arguments and ideas in terms of not just leftist politics, but just sort of maybe subjectivity, or how we think about some basic questions like the sort of, I almost want to say, the ontology of sex in general.
Okay, well, that's a big question.
Well, that's been the first hour doing this.
No. Actually, I would say the major crux of this book affects or discusses some of the most fundamental and meaningful categories in philosophy, right? Like, sex alone is something that I think has like enormous implications, especially given like the current climate of like gender, you know, this idea of like performativity, the idea of fluidity of genders. Like, we're talking about a renewed and revamped interest in the category of gender, the category of sex, but in a very strange and like sort of neutered way. In the words of like Joan Copjec, this is like a very neutered way of approaching sex, right? Sex has so much deeper implications than like what you choose to call yourself, what pronouns you use to describe yourself, right? And I think that Zupancic goes into that. Not only that, right? But not only the categories of sex and like how that is like kind of hot in our society right now, but the categories of like the real and the categories of like how being is related to knowledge and like whether there's a connection there, whether there is like some kind of ultimate Kantian or like Heideggerian like limit where like there's just no relation and we're like stuck in the category of knowledge in itself, or whether or not we have access to the material world and whether we can actually affect change in that place, or whether we're just stuck within our own categories of understanding and only describing something that we are a consequence of. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but like we'll go through this.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
This is like, I think like the main crux of this, right? Zupancic is arguing that essentially we do have a relationship with, it's not so much about the relationship between being and knowledge, but rather that we are as subjects in a privileged position to be able to affect not only the categories and the classifications that we use to describe the world, but also that unique position gives us the ability to actually change those categories in the materiality of the world. And yeah, it's a complicated argument, but we'll get into it. Yeah. So if you came to sleep through this one, I don't recommend you do that because you're going to get lost real fast.
And just to sort of add on one thing, or maybe to clarify, my understanding reading a lot of modern Lacanians is that their perspective on the nature of gender and sexuality is, not surprisingly, a fairly radical one, but it's pretty critical and definitely set in opposition to a lot of what I guess I would call not just like more modern liberal theorists. I'm thinking like people like Judith Butler and like her sort of contributions around the idea of performativity.
Yeah.
But also a lot of people who now fall into the camp of like affect theory. So Sarah Ahmed and people like Brian Musumi. And so there's a lot of, I think, theory around gender and sexuality that comes out of this affect theory tradition. And my understanding is that a lot of Lacanians, even if they have some sympathy with it, their perspective is sort of at the core, driving at something much more fundamental, much more philosophical, and maybe, I think we would probably both agree, much more radical in its implications.
Yeah, and they also take a particular focus on kind of attacking and trying to dismantle like this new nominalism or like the like object-oriented ontology.
New materialism and all that
stuff.
Yeah,
your subject is just another object among objects, and like it's just a relational type of situation. And they really, really take that to task and try to, pull apart some of those arguments.
It makes them big mad.
Yeah. Yes, to say the least. There's like, it's literally like half the book, like chapters 1 through 3 are like just discussing the sex and like relating it to the real and all this stuff. And then chapter 4 is called Object Disoriented Ontology. And it's like literally the whole second half of the book.
Yeah.
It's like, she goes, multiple different thinkers, multiple different perspectives on this relational kind of new nominalism, and kind of tries to just tear it apart.
For listeners too, just since we're going to have to touch on this, this sort of debate right now between these Lacanian psychoanalytic perspectives and, new nominalists, new materialists, affect theory, like this is kind of the main, I don't want to say like conflict, but definitely if you want to understand like, okay, the general theoretical landscape and a lot of the sort of radical intellectual projects right now, this seems to me to be the big one, at least for a lot of people on the left, is like which one of these camps you tend to align with. And so we're going to be reading from one of the camps and their critiques of the other one. But just to know that, this is kind of an encounter with the main division in a lot of philosophical theoretical thinking right now on the left. All right, well.
Want to get cracking?
I have to tell you, I feel like we're standing on a precipice and I'm looking down and there's just nothing but the abyss. And there's no one better that I would like to jump into that abyss with.
Fuck yeah,
my dear comrade.
Yeah, man.
This is your show.
Absolutely.
Where do you want to start?
Well, I know. Let's see. Let's, I guess, just start with the foreword. I mean, it's just kind of Zizek introducing what's going on in the book and kind of the series, right? Mm-hmm. It's like these short circuit series. He's kind of talking about trying to find interesting ways in which, disparate philosophical perspectives or cultural examples kind of function together to tease out some of the bigger psychoanalytic implications in, their philosophical perspective. If any of you guys have read a lot of these short circuit series books, but they all kind of have a similar introduction by Zizek, or a forward by him. He's kind of just arguing that if you're being properly critical, that you should basically be uncovering or discrediting what we would call like a proper functioning of the machine machinery of culture. If you find yourself operating within what would be called the proper functioning of the culture, you're not
big air quotes
going right. You're not being properly critical, I guess is what he's saying. And that Marx did this for political philosophy and religion, and that Freud did this for general ethics and morality, and that this was an attempt to recontextualize unthought dimensions as disavowed presuppositions, right? Which is I would say that's a tough statement, but just rewind the tape.
Your mind is going to be like, rewind that.
Rewind. Yeah, moving on. I mean, he's just kind of setting the stage. That's really...
Yeah, there's this line here that I really love, too, where he basically says that psychoanalysis in its Freudo-Lacanian lineage has been, among other things, a very powerful conceptual invention with direct and significant resonance in philosophy. So, I mean, I think Zizek is sort of the main person associated with this to say that Lacanian psychoanalysis is a privileged instrument of how to undermine this proper functioning of culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the way that Zupancic goes on to use psychoanalysis to try to tease apart this idea of the sexual is, you'll see why it's a privileged instrument, as Adam put it. Yeah, I don't know. Moving on to the introduction.
Can we read the first line? Because
sure.
I have to tell you, as soon as I started reading this book and I read the first line of the introduction, I was like, oh man, I'm here for it. I'm real fucking here for this.
I don't even remember. Okay, what was it? Hold on.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
So this is the first line of the introduction.
Yes.
For the moment, I am not fucking. I am talking to you. Well, I can have exactly the same satisfaction as if I were fucking. This is the example that Lacan comes up with to illustrate the claim that sublimation is satisfaction of the drive without repression.
Yeah.
That's why she's
quite
bae.
A way to start. Yeah.
That's why she's bae.
Yeah. So in that vein, she goes on to talk about, just in general, the strangeness of how our contemporary sexual discourse appears, right now. There's kind of like some obvious contradiction in the heart of sexuality, and she argues that it's not some negative feature that is to be cleared up, but that rather it is the constitutive feature of sexuality, this sort of disruptive contradiction. She mentions what Lacan terms extimacy.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Which is a kind of a concept that implies that something can be internal to a discourse, but specifically as its excluded supplement. So
can we slow that down for 1 second?
Sure. Yeah.
So this to me feels like a really key thing that you really get from not just psychoanalysis, but Lacanian psychoanalysis in general, is that the idea that with every like entity or phenomena or concept, there's always some excluded aspect of it that is never fully incorporated. It's the supplement.
Yeah.
And it's precisely Lacanian psychoanalytic perspectives which really focus on not only the role of the supplement and how it influences and shapes like the sort of structure of the thing, but also like the fact that everything is inherently disrupted or sort of fractured by this supplemental element that can never be fully included.
Yeah.
So I was wondering for Zupancic, I mean, my understanding is that sexuality or sex in general, it isn't something that you can take for granted. And it's not something that if we just expanded it in a certain way or thought about it in a certain way, it would sort of smooth out its edges. It's that sex in itself is the core philosophical encounter. And I think whenever we think about that, like sex is a philosophical problem, my understanding of that, and I'm curious for you to sort of speak on this too, is that it's sort of about the most basic fundamental concepts and experiences that we have. And that's precisely why sex is a philosophical problem and not just like a biological or a sociological one, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I was kind of saying before, in general common parlance, like people don't think of sex as deeply philosophical. Maybe they do if it's a domain that they study, maybe if you're like a psychology oriented type of person. Maybe sex is like a problem that most people face in their lives or like a thing that most people experience trouble with, but like you wouldn't necessarily imagine that sex is like at the heart of language's relation to meaning. Something like that, right? But yeah, it's very strongly argued here that sex is not just something that we just need to fulfill in the right way in our lives to like overcome, but that rather sex is a reflection or a representation of a fundamental constitutive rupture in the very like fabric of meaning and its relation to our being, and that we can't fill it in, and it's specifically because we can't that sex is fundamental to both Freud and Lacan, and that any attempt to argue that, to like diminish that fact, is in fact like a neutering of the category of sex, which I really like that she quotes Joan Copjec. I don't even remember where she does it. I think it's much later in the book, but there's a whole excellent essay by Joan Copjec that kind of talks about this, and she starts off by saying very strongly that the contemporary discourse on sex today, or gender, what she calls, gender, is a neutering of the concept or the philosophical implications of sex, and that we need to get back to the philosophical category of sex as it was intended by Freud or Lacan.
And we'll include a link to that article, because I know we were sharing that and talking about that as maybe something we would reference here.
Excellent, strongly worded essay.
So I want to ask one other question before we kind of get any deeper into the book. So whenever we talk about what is sex, are we talking about sex as a category of almost like sexual difference? Or are we also talking about sex as in like the sexual act as in coitus?
The sexual act is not really it absolutely is included in this like philosophical category, right? Like the sexual act is something that is directly related to philosophically the category of the sexual. But in this book, we're not really going to be talking too much about the sexual act. Maybe along the lines, we could maybe talk about how the sexual act is related to this, but I think really and truly what we're going to be talking about is like a very philosophical and a very psychoanalytic interpretation of what the category of the sexual is, and it's not what you're thinking of, like PNVG, like banging it out, turn the lights down, put on the Barry Manilow record. Barry Manilow, what the fuck?
No, Barry Manilow, I think in the 80s and 90s was like what you put on whenever you wanted to get laid.
Is it? Who am I? I don't even think I've ever listened to Barry Manilow. I don't know why I said Barry Manilow.
Floating out.
I think I was thinking Barry White, but it came out Manilow.
Is it Barry White?
What the hell does that mean?
I don't know. We'll pay some into the background.
Just the whole some Barry Manilow in the
episode is just light Barry Manilow in the background for the whole thing.
Oh God, Jesus!
Real philosophy hours here on Red Library.
Let's tease apart the philosophical implications of Barry Manilow.
Well, I wanted to clarify that too, because I know that whenever you see the title or see the title of the episode or hear us talking about the sexual or just sex in general, just to understand exactly where we putting our focus on. And because I think you could easily say, oh, okay, is it about the sexual act? And we're trying to understand the philosophical implications of that. But
there's some really interesting stuff about the sexual act really towards the end of the book. Basically, spoiler alert, the sexual act is like nihilistic in nature, and it relates to the death drive. So, masturbation is like hoping to kill yourself, kind of. But anyway, there's a lot of sad faces and fucking spam Fs in the chat.
Just have like the single tear emoji. Covering
it's
my
literally
cybergoth
there's literally
mask.
like a tear emoji in my notes. Like I put a tear emoji in there.
That's amazing.
Okay, but yes, we can get started. In chapter 1. I think because what we really want to do is get to what we're calling the sexual, because once again, it's not going to be familiar to you. We're going to depart from the act of sex very, very quickly. And we'll come back to it. But for now, let's try and define a little bit what it is that we're really referring to here, right? So Zupancic argues that Freudian notion of the sexual is reduced to the domain of sexual practice. And so she's also claiming that this fully invalidates category of the sexual. And so this is where we derive a need for the theory of psychoanalysis. She basically is arguing that the sexual is not like a defense against some deeper or more meaningful issue, but rather something that is inherently problematic and disruptive in itself. And it's not just disruptive of your like identity, right? But it's specifically disruptive of like the subjective ability to like relate to meaning itself. So it's a much, much deeper category, something that kind of penetrates, to use an interesting term, penetrates all the way kind of to the core of subjectivity. And she, once again, kind of like in the vein of like Copjec would say that we need to stop neutering this and taking it as like a superficial category of identity, because it's not. She said that psychoanalysis does not concern the human because it's like psychologizing the problem of sex as like an instinctual concern to humanity, but rather it places the sexual in the position of that which dehumanizes us and is irreducible to humanity. So it's something that she will go on to argue actually opens up the dimension of the universal because it is so fundamental to our subjectivity, but specifically it's the part that dehumanizes us.
I have to tell you, I'm so excited that this is going to be something that we get to focus on, because one of the things that I really love about this approach is it gives you a way to think about the universal versus the particular, which just to boil it down to its most simple way to describe it, most of, I think, what is at stake in a lot of radical leftist political discussion and theorizing and discourse right now is all about this question of the universal versus the particular. Who's universal? Oh, should we focus on particulars to sort of orient ourselves around subjectivity and political struggle because the universal is inherently this sort of colonized Western European sort of approach? But I think what Lacanian perspectives do is they open up the idea of the universal in a way that is just very like bizarre and alien, but also I think really promising and really, to me, like earth-shattering whenever you start to get your hands on exactly what they're talking about.
Yeah. To add to that, so a good way to think about this concept, right, of the sexual, as it relates to something like universality, is the idea that the sexual is not what makes us human, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just like some human characteristic that we have. Rather, it's what makes us subject. The full implications of what it means to be subject. You can imagine, like, if there's a king and you're the subject of the king, right? You are somebody who has fealty or has like some inherent obligation to or toward the thing that makes you subject. And I think that also it carries that implication of subjectivity as such, like you are a subject or you are someone who speaks from the position of being subject, right? And I think that overall, generally in psychoanalysis, subject is a much preferable term, right, to like human, person, whatever the fuck else you could call
whatever
someone.
The fuck you assholes.
Yeah, whatever the fuck you goddamn, cultured animals.
So I want to actually touch on something really quick about this too, because what I really think is also really important to understand about this perspective is that, post-Foucault, the idea of grounding your sort of political project on the idea of being human or like universal human rights is this inherently problematized position now, because who gets to count as being human, right? Yeah. And so what I really think is so, again, counterintuitive, but so radical and really interesting about the Lacanian perspective is that they seem to ground the idea of universality not on being human, but on being dehumanized in a very particular way, in this very disruptive way. And I know that, a lot of the critiques from people like Judith Butler and a lot of the affect theorists are very much like, we don't want to be subjects because the idea of being a subject is so tied into this Western European sort of tradition. But again, like the idea of being a subject in this perspective is like inherently disruptive. So
it provides the ground. It's the most subversive position, and thus gives you specifically access to the universal because you are radically outside of that like colonized space of meaning and like the domination of language by like some overarching whatever like sort of master or signifier, right? Like because subject resonates with that rupture, it actually gives you the potential to break outside of how meaning wants to make you its consequence or force you into a certain way of being, right? You can radically be outside of that. And that's it's specifically subject as this rupture that gives you that space to like be outside. And so that's once again coming back to that idea of extimacy, like that Lacanian concept of extimacy, right? It's something very inherent to you, but rather specifically as a representation of what is excluded. Anyway, go ahead.
There's just this quick line here. This is on page 7 where she says, and this inhuman aspect of sexuality is what Lacan emphasizes in various different ways, including his famous invention of the Lamella. And so again, that's another like Lacanian concept that is sort of trying to just put some name or some signifier on this sort of inhuman excluded aspect of sexuality. So I just thought it was a really, again, this is Zupancic's writing, very short, concise, but just bam, there it is.
Yeah,
like,
here's another. Concept. I've got from that same page, I got another quote. So it would be a big mistake to consider that in Freudian theory, the sexual is the ultimate horizon of the animal called human, or a kind of anchor point of irreducible humanity in psychoanalytic theory. On the contrary, it is the operator of the inhuman. the operator of dehumanization, which I thought is just like, mwah,
yeah,
just mwah. So basically her argument here in this little chapter is that psychoanalysis is aiming to reorient sex or the sexual back into its meaning in the real. And what's meant by that is, it's a complicated journey that we're going to take to explain that, but basically that the sexual is a category of meaninglessness, but not in the sense that it doesn't matter, but in the sense that it specifically has to be represented as outside of some fully constituted meaning in order to give that privileged place to subjectivity. And so this category is like extremely extremely potent, and you'll see how, and as soon as we start to try to tease it apart, that's when we're going to really get into these bigger metaphysical questions of like meaning, ontology, philosophy in general, whether psychoanalysis can really be considered in the category of philosophy, things like that. Moving on to the next chapter is called Where Do Adults Come From? I like that title. But she kind of starts talking about this idea of infantile sexuality and Freud, and how it's kind of not really that different from mature sexuality, which is kind of not the common way of thinking about that, right? Like you think infantile sexuality is like the special category of sexuality, but she kind of argues like, no, it's not really any different than mature sexuality. Like nothing vouchsafes your sexuality. Like biology doesn't really fully cover it, culture doesn't really fully cover it. And she's kind of asking the question, like, why is this so? What is it about the sexual that still fascinates us? Like some things you can kind of get an explanation for, right? Like, Ancient Aliens is always trying to problematize like how we've got pyramids in Egypt, right? But if you just read the goddamn archaeology, it's like pretty well explained.
But Alex, aliens.
But she's kind of saying here that like there's no archaeology of sexuality, right? In fact, the archaeology of sexuality is like an empty tome that like when you go to try to find it, what you find is that nothing appears in that place. And so
I just want to say really quick, I'm looking on page 8, and where she says that infantile sexuality is a paradoxical sort of thing, and the reason why it is, and I really love this, she says that basically it exists in the absence of both a biological framework for sexuality, like it's fulfilling a certain function, and also a symbolic framework. And so the idea that it's sort of it's paradoxical because you can't really understand what the fuck is or what it's doing without those two frameworks, because those are usually the ones that we associate with what sexuality is.
Yeah. Ultimately, she's kind of saying like, despite you maturing as like a subject, right? The sexual never really gets to this point of like homogeneous unity, right? Or like some kind of organic completion, right? It remains a category that is puzzling, is problematic. It's like at the heart of a lot of the problems in your life, maybe, or something that you struggle with, even if you're whatever, like fully engaged in sex and you think that you have like some mature perspective on it, right? It's still something that disjoints us, right? And she relates that disjointedness of sex to this idea that sex is something that is primordially disjointed. And so I'll kind of explain what it is that she means by this. She's kind of saying that the disjointedness of sex originates from what we might call like enigmatic signifiers, okay? And signifiers is just a fancy way of saying words, okay? So don't get too lost here, right? But they're enigmatic in the sense that when you are a kid or like a baby subject, and someone is, you're starting to experience the sexual, but you don't understand it. Someone comes and usually fills in that information, whether it be, inadvertently, or whether it be something they intentionally try to tell you to fill in your gaps of knowledge about sex. Maybe they give you a rundown of the birds and the bees, or maybe they fucking slap you on the ass and say, go run out and put your dick in something. I don't know what they did, when you're a kid, but just, understand someone tried to fill in that knowledge for you, okay?
It could go either way, really. Like slap you on the ass, go out and fuck something, or it could be here's how nature works. But either way, you're having the sort of symbolic framework of the other is being plastered over your gaps and the sort of paradoxical nature of sexuality.
Exactly. But that's not even the whole story, right? Somebody else is filling in your gaps in knowledge. But the interesting thing, and the idea of primordially being disjointed enters here. What that person is filling in your knowledge with is something that doesn't really have a full constituted way of being for them, right? Like we were talking about, even as a mature subject, sex is still a non-complete or a non-fully functioning idea, right? It's something that you kind of understand that it happens, but it doesn't really have some representative in the big other, right? Or something that like it doesn't have like a thing that vouchsafes it or guarantees that you're correct.
Because I wanted to ask you, is this also a place to reference the idea of the big other and how our experience of the big other is sort of like the superego or whatever that is that, oh, this is this perfectly whole functioning sort of thing, but really what I want to say like projecting into it is this sort of wholeness that we don't have, that is sort of an impossibility for us, but we can sort of find it or feel that it exists in this big other, the superego, whatever that is.
Yeah, so this idea of primordially disjointed sex is just this kind of way that incompleteness of the signifiers that you use to fill in your knowledge about sex, already incomplete before it fills in your gaps in knowledge, right? Even in the other mature subject that attempts to fill in your gaps. So there is an incompleteness in the idea of the sexual that precedes any of the sexual existing within your framework of meaning. And that she's kind of arguing that incompleteness in the meaning of the sexual is actually prior to or that occurs before meaning itself, right? That this is never something that gets filled in and in some sense generates a lot of the need for meaning in the first place, is like this sort of primordially disjointedness of sex. It's both the thing that generates your existence, a sexual encounter, right? Some kind of conception there, but also the thing that plagues your existence throughout your whole life, right? Like, what is this goddamn category? It never gets completed. And so she kind of says, therefore, one's unconscious is first the unconscious of the other and not some primordially repressed thing. Repression is simply the signifying form through which we are marked for the unconscious that will eventually be ours, which is a really complicated way of saying that, yeah, before we even get this knowledge filled in for ourselves, it's like getting filled in by a blank page, right? Like, we need page 57. And when we turn to page 57, it just says like, see some book that doesn't exist, right? And it's just kind of like a referent that covers up this huge hole and puts kinks in the signifying chain, right? So you could kind of think of it as like meaning being relational, or meaning having this sort of like chain of signifiers that are related and generate our web, or like our map of our maps of meaning. Big
shout out.
Yeah, big shout out.
JVP. Hope you're recovering.
God damn it, yeah, man. Good luck in rehab, bro.
Good luck, son.
Good luck, son. But basically, that if you think of, there's like a signifying chain that relates ideas to one another, this gap of the sexual creates kinks in that chain. And that's important. It's an important concept for later, because as of right now, you just got a kinky chain, and that's okay.
That's it.
Right? But later we'll see how that kinky chain actually becomes something that an analyst can use to determine or make sense of how you're relating to a trauma, or just even fundamentally how your life of meaning is shaped around your experiences. And that's extremely fundamental to like being subject. So
yeah, so almost like the idea that it's through the disruptions or through the kinks in the chain that you then can sort of have an insight into this, the way that this develops, or how this has like shaped your life in a particular way.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And yeah, so it's kind of like she's kind of saying we don't pull away from that which is repressed. We are also pulled in by that which is repressed, specifically by the things that are supposedly being disclosed to us in discourse. And she's kind of saying sex is constitutively unconscious, and that it's kind of, unconscious when it first occurs, and not something that is ever discernible and clear, because a lot of people think of sexuality as repressed, right? And she's kind of trying to make the argument like, this is not something that's just like repressed. It's not something that existed in a constituted way and then just gets like, you forget it, or you shove it down, and you try to not remember it. It's more like it never had that quality of being fully constituted in the first place, and your information that you get about it that's initial is already incomplete and unconscious.
I think it's in the first chapter, but she makes this short little joke that I think really drives the point home, where she says that, in Victorian era Vienna, the question to the Freudians would be, why is it that you're talking about dirty sex all the time? But the properly Freudian answer is to say, well, what is this sex that you're talking about?
Yeah.
It's like the idea that you even pose the question of what is sex is kind of like a very simplified way of trying to understand like that we have to recomplicate the idea of sex in the first place. And yeah, and it's not this very simplified idea of like, oh yeah, it's just already here and it's sort of constituted in this coherent way and we're just repressing it. It's something much more sort of disturbing and weird than that.
You know, I'd say that's a pretty good summation of that first chapter.
Yeah, killing it, son. Killing it.
Cracking. We got to get cracking through this. This is a long
This is a long book.
It's going to be long as fuck.
It's very dense. There's a lot going on every page.
So let's move on to this idea. The next chapter is about Christianity. She specifically calls out Christianity here.
Christianity getting called out on Red Library.
Red Library. Look out, Pope. So
Getting dragged.
But so she kind of talks about in Christianity, there are a lot of examples of like what you might consider like perverted drives or like partial drives. And she kind of talks about how the perspective within Christianity is that sexuality is something natural and that is like driven by reproduction, and that any other perspective on sex is like a perversion, right? Like they kind of see it as like, that's wrong, that's asocial. Don't take the sexual out of its context, which is holy, you know, as like this union, it needs to be reverent or something. Any other interest in sexuality is like a perversion or some kind of moral deviance.
So the idea that be fruitful and multiply is the only function of sexuality.
Right. And, you know, I don't know, maybe you guys are familiar with Zizek, but he always brings up this topic of like, he kind of always asks this question, like, isn't that how animals reproduce? Like animals reproduce for reproduction, right? It's like some kind of cycle or the season when there's fertility and then they fuck because they need to have babies. It's specifically people that don't do it for reproduction, right? We wear condoms, we have fucking IUDs, and like, you know,
I was wondering if you were going to say IEDs.
We have IEDs. Watch out, girl. Like, I fuck like an IED.
That's a joke for the patrons from our
Bigelow Catherine Bigelow episode. So essentially, it's kind of an odd thing for the church to proclaim, right? That like sexuality should only be for reproduction, because then what distinguishes us from animals, right? Animals don't have souls. If we're having sex just for the purposes of reproduction, then aren't we just animals? And so I don't know, interesting question, but she kind of goes on here to sort of call it out. She kind of says like, it's interesting that there's nothing particularly asocial in these partial drives. She kind of like, it's a little heretical, right? But she kind of says that we consume the body of Christ. And I mean, if you want to use your imagination on that one, and just think, you know, taking someone's body into your mouth.
Yeah.
You know, and she kind of is arguing that this is the social bond par excellence in Christianity, right? Like you take the body of Christ into your body, and that, you know, so she's kind of like, so what's with this perversion stuff, right? Like, why are you, you know, like, why are you calling out, you know, these like little perverse drives and saying that these things are not okay when, you know, the main crux of like Christian inclusion is like to take someone's body into your
a
own.
Highly sexual act. Yeah.
It's very, very intimate, right?
Yeah. Whenever I think about the Eucharist, I just really think about the mouthfeel.
Those wafers, bro. So anyway, yeah, we're getting a kick out of this one. So she goes on to talk about how historically Christianity kind of relies on this perversity, or what you might relate to, ding, 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 the Freudian infantile sexuality, right? And these sort of partial drives or objects that evoke enjoyment, but specifically deprived of a sexual link, right? And they can only function if they're deprived of that sexual link. And she really highlights this, right? You could think of like when you're a kid and you're watching fucking cartoons, right? People getting smashed and cut into little pieces, and it's enjoyment. It's just like sort of like a pure feeling of enjoyment, but it always kind of has to be deprived from that link to something sexual, because once it becomes sexual, it becomes serious. And that's kind of like also a common theme in like movies, right? This is why you can't go to a movie and just like, you know, have a good drama, just have like one full scene of like penetration sex, you know, like
we were just talking about this not only with Nymphomaniac by Lars von Trier, but also Love by Gaspar Noé, because they both have attempted to do this, to show the full-on sexual act without the sort of repression or the sort of like censor on it, and it just like does not function. No, it doesn't work. It's not good. No bueno.
No bueno. Yeah, so she kind of talks about, okay, well, what is it exactly that is at the heart of this fascination with partial drives in Christianity? You know, what's really being banned here? because she kind of says, look, Christianity is rife with examples of these like strange partial drives. She has an example of Saint Agatha by Lorenzo Lippi. She has like the picture of the actual painting in the book, and it's like a woman with like a silver platter with titties on it, like someone cut someone's breasts off.
Yeah.
And it's a famous image, but it's like a Christian story behind it, and gouged out eyes. She talks about all these different examples of these sort of partial drives in Christianity, and like how there doesn't seem to be any kind of problematic dimension in any of those partial drives, despite those things generally relating to the sexual in some way, right? Or at least implying the sexual, you would imagine. And she kind of talks about what's actually being banned in Christianity is the partial drive's relation to the sexual. That the sexual in Christianity is preserved or kept exclusively for that reproductive act, and everything else, even though it might be hinting at the sexual, even though it has like Christianity's riddled with these examples of like kind of this weird innuendo of partial drives, like taking the Eucharist, taking it. Sorry, I love that. But it's sort of like what it's trying to do is it's trying to privilege the sexual or prevent the sexual, maybe because Christianity itself recognizes the potential of the sexual question and the sort of rupture that would exist within the meaning that they're trying to establish as overarchingly explained by the God above, right? And like the sort of consistency of meaning that the church is trying to present as the heart of Christianity. Sex fucking tears right through that.
Yeah, so in some ways it's almost like this defensive strategic sort of play to understand that our sort of system of meaning or our sort of system of signifiers wouldn't be able to function in the way that we want it to if sexuality wasn't sort of split off from reproduction in this way, or it needs to be split off from reproduction in this way. And that's why you have this sort of proliferation of these partial objects and partial drives in a lot of Christian iconography and art. Yeah,
and what Christianity is doing is it's refocusing us, as subjects, from what is sexual to what is natural. And so they kind of try to define sexuality as like this normative, natural practice, right? Of course, as good ideological critique, we know that anytime somebody fucking says nature, there's a problematic dimension in that shit, right? Natural, huh? What's natural exactly?
Immediately alarms start going off.
You're like, so yeah, nature is problematic in that how? Well, it requires culture, right? Like it requires our otherness to it. Or you could think of it as like by creating a domain, which we would call nature, there implicitly is an implied otherness that includes us, right? Because we're not just fully nature. Like we're not like the rocks and the trees. And so by defining nature, we are creating a certain kind of culture that is a necessary supplement to that idea. And it includes us, right? So all of a sudden we change the whole scope of the domain of what natural should probably mean, right? But yeah, so they're situating the sexual in the dimension of nature.
Let me ask you a quick question about this. So whenever we think about Christianity's need to repress the sexual or to sort of split it off from reproduction, for either Zupancic or just the Lacanian perspective in general, is the idea that the reason why that's so threatening to Christianity or the sort of like metaphysics of Christianity is because that in Christianity, I think in more traditional sort of ways of thinking about it, it's that everything is coherent and like the idea of God in heaven above like means that everything makes sense. The world functions in regards to this particular logic or particular sort of divine will, but sexuality would fundamentally disrupt that. Is that what you would say the sort of threat is?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the only mystery worth investing in Christianity is that of the divine, right? And like I think that ultimately what they're afraid of is that you will recognize that there is no master signifier, there is no full constituted explanation of the sexual. And so what they're doing is they're situating the sexual within a natural context of like being fully constituted. There's masculine and feminine. It's like the yin and the yang. They fit together and they're the two halves of like this perfectly fully constituted humanity that we exist in. And the only mystery that you have left to focus on is God, right? And like what it is that you need to do for him, right? And it's kind of like you're able to look at whatever you want. Tits, disembodied tits, like fucking eyes being gouged out. Like you could take Jesus into your mouth and like all of these things, right? But like none of that, as long as they're deprived of the sexual link, then all of those things are permitted, right? And so it's a certain kind of way of defanging or like taking the insidiousness out of all of existence, right? Natural existence, in order to situate all of the fascination and mystery in the divine, as opposed to the inherent way that the sexual already like mystifies and forces us to sort of assume or expect a fantasy in the natural itself.
So almost like Copjec was saying, it's a way of neutering the sexual.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
So here's a good summation here.
Spit it.
It is not so much that culture ends up being nature, right, in this exchange of this sort of problematic natural. It's rather that culture is generated where nature is lacking. And where is nature lacking? Specifically with regard to the sexual, right? There's no filling in of that information. You know, once again, that information comes to you from another subject that got it filled in for them, and always that information is sort of primordially incomplete. So what is being banned in the Christian narrative is not the signifier of the sexual, not the name of the sexual, but rather the unconscious knowledge that there is no signifier of the sexual, right? So you can talk about sex all you want. You just can't recognize that sex has this inherent inconsistency in it. And it's kind of like what you were talking about before, like where the criticism of Freud, why always talking about these dirty sexual things, right? But the real subversive question is asking specifically, what the fuck is it, the sex?
Yeah.
What is it in sex that makes us see this dirty perversion or like this like inconsistency in it?
And this is also precisely why to talk about sex in this way is precisely to pose an epistemological question. This is where that connection to like the nature of meaning and like the real to like knowledge and understanding and meaning and purpose sort of is because a lot of this has to come down to the fact of how we're filling in these gaps in knowledge, and the fact that sexuality is something that kind of exists only as like what looks like a razor thin piece of paper. Like it looks like it has substance, but it's really just like a referent for nothing that's actually underneath of it, or for something that isn't actually coherent in any meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then here also sort of taking Christianity to task too, because she's claiming that by generating this like normative cultural image of what sexuality consists of, that you're basically making a promise in the realm of the sexual, right? This promise of this complete, fully constituted experience or generation of completeness and the connection in the sexual experience that never appears, right? And so it generates this like phantasmatic image that you could have some satisfaction if only you had this perfect sexual relation or like knowledge about how to accomplish it disclosed to you, which is like this unexpected sort of consequence of trying to paint over the huge gaping hole where sex is with this like nice fully constituted mythos of like masculine and feminine and how they complement each other. And you know, it generates this idea that the sexual relation is possible.
And in the Lacanian tradition, one of the basic fundamental precepts that we all operate on is that there is no sexual relationship.
Right, there is no sexual relation. And at the end of the day, that fact is so fundamental to so much of the argumentation in this book. Like really, it is an irreconcilable gap, right? It's something that you cannot overcome. You can paint over it in any different kind of way, and she's going to go through a ton of different ways that this tries to get painted over, right, by all these different discourses. But really, at the end of the day, the insistence upon sex being something that cannot be contained in that way is what she's going to continue to emphasize. Moving on from
from just dragging Christianity
real hard. You know, I have a lot of quotes and stuff from this, but I feel like, you know, I want to get to the meat, which comes much later. So
do you want to move on to chapter 2?
Yeah, I think we'll jump into chapter 2. I think you know, we covered pretty much what it is that's being said there.
One thing while you're getting ready to start chapter 2, I guess to me it's also important to start with Christianity here to just show that this sort of response to the gap of sexuality is something that, you know, is a very like fundamental problem that religion itself tries to solve. And there are other different discourses that try to solve the problem in different ways. But it's just to me, it's helpful to start with Christianity to say that this isn't just some like weird abstract philosophical thing that a bunch of modern theorists have been trying to do. This is something that's kind of a fundamental rupture in the experience of subjectivity and being human itself, and hence there are many, many ways we've tried to paper over that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, she gets into that right away. I mean, so I have in my notes, it's like chapter 2, the chapter about politics. It's like a huge bold. So like this is the one where she starts, she relates this concept to the political. And, she kind of starts off by saying that in the realm of the political, or like when we try to relate sexuality and politics, right? You're either just going to dismiss the sexual altogether, being like, well, that's a social phenomenon. That's not something that is like relevant to the domain of politics, right? Privilege other topic. Or you're going to treat it with like a certain kind of like permissiveness, like, yeah, do whatever you want. Everything's fine there. It's like either kind of prohibited / dismissed, or it's like fully permitted, just don't do anything bad, like no abuse, like no non-consensual stuff, right? But like you're either just gonna be like, yeah, sex is fine, or you're gonna be like, no, that's not our domain here, that's not something that we deal with.
And would you say for either of those, the idea is still that either, sexuality is something that's just a non-problem or a non-issue, or even if the idea is like, well, let's just maximize like permissiveness or sort of the expansion of like sexual identity and practices, it's still assuming that underneath sexuality is this sort of coherent thing. We just need to remove the repression and put certain sort of like guidelines against harm in place.
Yeah, absolutely. It does come along with that sort of implication, right?
Okay.
Like the permissiveness is there so that we don't get too hung up in the way that sex can be, a little spicy, right? Like if we don't let people do what they're supposed to, right? And it's also kind of inherently prohibiting any overly passionate or zealous engagement with sex, right? Like don't be too passionate in what you do, because that kind of zeal is seen as like unsavory, right? Like you can't be, it's almost like it bleeds into the realm of the political, right? Like the nice, moderate, appropriate political stance is that you don't get overzealous about any of your political perspectives, because then you're seen as like an extremist.
Yeah, radical
right?
fundamentalist.
Yeah, don't be radical, like healthcare for everyone. What are you talking about? Too radical. But anyway,
is that your Tucker Carlson impression?
I don't fucking know what that was.
You got your little fucking vest on.
Yes. She's saying like both of these attitudes fail, right? They both read the sexual as something that's just constituted as a something, right, in the first place, and that it can actually be deemed less or more important than something else, or to just be something that can abide or be coolly stuck with, right, and just don't overcommit. But that both of these attitudes persist in trying to conceive of the political and the sexual as categories in the order of being, as opposed to, their true nature, which is not something that you'd find in the category of being. What we really need is the domain of the impossible, right? To speak about the category of sexuality. And so she's kind of talking about how sexuality is related to politics, not in that they're simple categories of being, but rather that they both imply something that is not in the order of being, and it is in the order of what Lacan conceptualizes as the real, or what you might call being's inherent impasse, right? Or like the thing that's in being, but specifically as an absence.
So
right?
Can we just very quickly, as much as it's possible, reference Hegel in regard to this idea that the nature of being itself is inherently like fractured, or there's something that is non-coherent about it?
Yeah. You want me to tell you? Why don't you expand on that?
Well, I guess my thought is that, in studying Lacan, there's kind of this like really funny thing, and they talk about McGowan and Ryan Ainley talk about this on Why Theory, is that Lacan was very explicit about not sort of seeing himself as being in the tradition of Hegel or like following that path. And yet he somehow comes to these conclusions that are very Hegelian in nature. Yeah. And this is
actually when he starts to deny Hegel the most that he actually starts to have a more like ontologically Hegelian viewpoint, right? Like later in his work. So,
but to me, this is something that I think emerges out of a lot of thinkers who tend to have this as like a core, like fundamental starting point, like Zizek, like Zupancic, Lacan. They're also very closely in line with Hegel in this perspective that, there is a cut through being itself. And the idea is that our starting place has to be to sort of wrestle and grapple with that fact, regardless of how terrifying and sort of like, crushing it is to think that there is no coherence that is achievable in being. And it's because, not just because it's a failure of us, but it's in being itself that we find this. It's not just sort of a limitation of our own understanding and our own capabilities as subjects. It's something inherent in reality that we're encountering. And that's why it's the real. Yeah. With a capital R.
With capital R. That's, imaginary, symbolic, and real. Like capital R, real.
Keeping it capital R, real 100 on Red Library.
100 real.
When keeping it real goes wrong.
Oh, Jesus. No, man. I love Chappelle.
That was a
big ups to Chappelle.
Too. I know,
What's
big
up,
ups.
man?
That was classic shit.
Vernon Franklin, once a heartwarming story of perseverance.
Wu-Tang!
Today, a sparkling example of when keeping it real goes wrong.
Change comedy forever.
Yeah. So, okay,
unlike this fucking show.
Unlike. Hey, man. She actually has a book on comedy.
She does. Maybe
it's interesting, but not as interesting as this.
Yeah, this one is the real keeper, I think.
This is the good one. Sex as an impasse, or an absence or a hiccup, right, in the signifying chain, acts as both the structuring absence, right? It's like something like, if you try to quit smoking cigarettes, the problem is you're going to see it everywhere. Like if you conceive of yourself as trying to quit and prohibiting something, that something appears as the structuring component to your whole life now because it's being prohibited.
Yeah, precisely because it's now absent.
Yeah, because it's an absence, it actually structures all of the things that are present. Your morning walk is now a morning walk without cigarettes. Your coffee, your day at work is now a coffee or a day at work without cigarettes, right? So everything now takes on this component of being related to the absence.
Yeah. And sexual gratification is now sexual gratification without a cigarette.
Without a cigarette, right. Yeah. You got to have one of those after.
Now, I just have to tell you, that was a really, really good explanation of that, because that is it's a core thing to understand about the Lacanian perspective, and it's also really complicated to find a way to make that really tangible. So I thought that was very good.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome, bud.
And so, it's both the structuring absence, right, shaping the symbolic totality, and the cause of the relational link between people, between beings. It's and this is specifically talking about sex, right? Not cigarettes. But they give. She actually
keep up, assholes.
Yeah, keep up, goddammit. So she actually uses an example of the unicorn. She talks about how there is no unicorn, right? Like unicorns aren't anywhere to be found, right? But when I say the word unicorn, everybody fucking knows what a unicorn is, right? Everyone can conceive of it. Similarly, sex is all over the place. It's kind of the opposite, right? Like sex is everywhere. Like I talk about sex, you know exactly what I mean. It's everywhere, but no one can conceive of the concept of sex. So the concept of sex is like the unicorn that doesn't appear. So it's kind of, you flip your brain around a little, just fucking think through it, okay?
Yeah,
take your time.
Caps.
You can hit rewind if you need to.
I mean, it's real philosophy hours. I mean, people know what they're getting here.
Like, look, guys, if you got this far, I think, hopefully you can.
If you ever just shut this shit off.
It's like, these fucking idiot assholes don't have shit.
Assholes.
But so, yeah, it's specifically the only way that you can resort or like refer to the concept of sex is to resort to some stand-in, some papering over of that concept, right? Because there's no in itself of that concept representationally. And so she kind of says there is sex only in something that does not work, and thusly there is no sexual relation. So it shouldn't be taken too hastily. It's a difficult concept, right? Ontological recognition of the impossibility of the relation. That concept. So she also wants to emphasize that concept, right? This impossibility is also not to be taken as the solution to the sexual problem, right? Because she says it's really tempting to think of this ontological incompleteness that we're kind of describing here in the idea of the sexual as like a fix, right? Like, oh, well, that's the solution, right? Like sex is a problem. I need to fill it in. Well, I can just fill it in with its own impossibility. And then it just like, it just fills in the gap. No, wrong, bad, stupid. You're fired. So like,
holy shit.
Don't do it. Stop doing it.
No.
You think that you don't. But so basically, yeah, she's kind of saying it's almost exactly the contrary. It's the contrary solution. She's saying the impossibility of the sexual relation is the ground upon which there can be relations or ties in being as we know them, or in meaning as we know them. It's not so much that you can just call the gap impossible and call it a day, and then you can have your nice relational fucking nominal universe, right? No, right? Like it persists, but it's specifically because it persists that we're able to be subject, that we're able to relate meaning, have it gravitate around that absence in its center, right? And so she's kind of developing a structure of ontology that, well, she's not even, Lacan did this, but she's describing that sex is at the heart of that ontological structure, and that's why it's so important. We shouldn't neuter sex to be some kind of category of superficial identities or something like that. Like, this is fundamental. It's like at the heart of meaning, there's this impasse, right? And sex is its like direct stand-in or counterpart because it represents the impossibility of filling in that space with meaning.
I also have to say too, I mean, this strikes me as a very particularly dialectical way to think about sex. Is that sex
materialism, dialectical materialism, right? As impossible as that term is, right? This is the impossibility.
Yeah, well, that's what strikes me is, right, is like if you were just to like focus on the impossibility and then call it a day and just say, oh, okay, well then, yeah, like everything there, it is impossible to have any sort of relational, subjective kind of thing emerge out of this. That would also be to obscure one half of the dialectic. And the point is to say, yes, it is to acknowledge the impossibility, and also to acknowledge in this weird, strange way that it's precisely the impossibility that creates the possibility of relation as well. Again, I don't think she uses the word dialectical, but it strikes me that that's kind of what we're getting at here. That's kind of a way to think about it.
Well, at the end of the book, she mentions it, but in a different context. She's talking about some other stuff. Yeah, absolutely. I think even here we can say this is already entering the realm of the dialectical.
Do you mind if I read a quote really fast? This is on 25.
Is it on 24?
Actually, it's on 25.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So it's the one about the phrase in Lacanian psychoanalysis that can be very controversial, which is that woman does not exist.
Ooh, yes.
This is a little bit long, but I think this is really beautiful. She says, the aim to abolish the non-relation and to replace it with a relation with a capital R is rather the trademark of all social repression. Sexual difference in the oppression of women are a very good example of this. The most oppressive societies have always been those which axiomatically proclaimed or enforced the existence of this sexual relation. A harmonious relation presupposes an exact definition of the essences involved in this relation and of the roles pertaining to them. If there is to be a relation, women need to be such and such and so on and so on. A woman who doesn't know her place is a menace to the image of the relation as a totality of two elements that complement each other, for example, or as any other kind of quote-unquote cosmic order. To this, psychoanalysis does not respond by saying that woman is in fact something other than what these oppressive orders make her out to be, but with a very different and much more powerful claim. Woman does not exist. So to me, that is one of, hands down, the best descriptions of what that means in psychoanalysis.
Fucking murders it. Just fucking slams it on the table and just like, here, motherfuckers. So it's really interesting, right? This is getting into the concept that there is not a divided heterogeneity in culture and society between men and women, right? But that rather there's this concept that we are all of the same substance, and it is specifically women that are othered in that relation. But it's not even being othered, right? Because if they were to be othered, then you could say that there's a material or a category of being that is woman, right? But she's saying rather, no, like women, men, we all are subject to this like sexual, like sort of castrated existence. It's the fact that woman doesn't exist, right? Because they're pushing the category of woman outside of the masculine and therefore pushing it outside of existence. And so that's what Lacanian analysis is trying to say about, that's what they're kind of referencing when they say this ridiculous phrase, woman does not exist, right? It's not just like trying to discount the credibility of women or like the existence of women, right?
Or that it's like a hyper masculine perspective.
Yeah, like some kind of like, and this is what's always said about Freud too, like everything's just everything's just sexualized and blah blah blah. Well, yeah, but because sex has this kind of implication to it, right? Yeah. And the hyper masculinity or the phallus and like all of these ideas that relate to the masculine in psychoanalysis are specifically so because of the privileged place of the feminine. It's something that has a completely different kind of definition, not because it's not as important, but it's almost because it's way more important.
It's way more important.
It's the structuring principle.
Yeah, it's way more radical and subversive too. And I think a very sort of fidelitous like psychoanalytic perspective, and not like the bullshit stereotypes that are overly simplified and misunderstood about psychoanalysis.
Yeah, or I wanted to read this. It's like a little bit before the one that you said. It's on 24, I think. But I just want to make sure this is the actual one I want to read.
Do it.
Okay, yeah. So this is just kind of restating what we were talking about. The non-relation gives or dictates the conditions of what ties us, which is to say that it is not a simple indifferent absence, right? But an absence that curves and determines the structure with which it appears. The non-relation is not the opposite of the relationship. It is the inherent logic of the relationship, the relationships that are possible and existing. That logic is represented as a fundamental antagonism. So just to summarize that like section, because I feel like it's just important to restate. And then, your quote actually came from the next chapter, which we can just move on into now. She kind of starts it off by talking about this idea of the anti-sexist, which is a concept in a really interesting writer, Andrei Platonov.
Who you've mentioned on the show before.
Yeah. I was really interesting, maybe like the Russian Beckett or something. I don't know. Whatever the fuck.
It's high praise indeed.
Yeah, but so interesting guy. But she kind of has this passage here. This is a topic that Zizek talks about sometimes, right? Okay, so the anti-sexist is basically like, well, we have this problem in society of sexual fulfillment kind of being lacking, right? Where people are too focused on sex and they're not able to like be purely dedicated to, the establishment of this new communist society. And so they come up with this device, right? It's the anti-sexist device. And basically what it is like a pocket pussy. I don't know how else to describe this.
Like a fleshlight?
Like a fleshlight, yeah. So basically, it's something that will alleviate the dependency on the sexual gratification, and it will sort of liberate all the libidinal energy that's pent up in people around sex, and hopefully make them better able to dedicate themselves to the cause of building the new society. It's specifically kind of like what we were talking about before, right? To just fill in the impossibility with the statement that it's impossible, right? And just say, well, here you go. Here's a device that will just take care of your sexual gratification for you, so that you don't have to really concern yourself with how that gratification is like persistent and never fully filled in, or that the lack of gratification is never fully filled in, because no matter how many holes you put it in, you always want to put it in another one. Sorry, but anyway,
that's a direct quote.
It's Zupancic said that.
That's on page 20.
But so I wanted to, on the next page, this is like one of the most crucial lines I thought in this entire chapter. This line of thought basically starts that it's the point that we were already making, that you can't just acknowledge the impossibility of the non-relation and just put up with it. It may seem like the non-relation should be the dominant ideology of like capitalist democracy, right? That we need this like sort of interrelational logic to deal with the impossibility of pure relationality. But it's not just like Zupancic here, and Lacan through Lacan is arguing that the impossibility of the relation is not something that leaves us with like perfect pluralistic neutrality of social being, right? Like what we would hope a democracy could alleviate through representation and like the majority struggles and like trying to compromise on like the things people need from their own different categories of life. She's saying no. What the Lacanian non-relation means is that precisely that there is no neutrality of the social body, of social being. That, once again, kind of like I was saying before, there is only one category of being, right? And it's sort of like this masculine sexual drive, right? And then the other half is only present when we artificially impose some kind of naturalistic way of conceiving of a subjectivity, right? As like your masculine and feminine totality that has some kind of fluid spectrum that relates one to the other. And it's like these two things in conjunction make a totality. Well, they're saying, no, what we have is homogeneity of all the same type of sexual drives in all different forms, and then we have one thing that structures all of it, which is like intimately excluded, which is like the feminine, right? And so she goes on to say, to conceive democracy, for example, as a more or less successful negotiation between elements of a fundamentally neutral social being is to overlook, indeed to repress, this consequential negativity operative at the very core of the social order. And normally when this idea of like a neutral, pluralistic social being is employed, it's usually kind of like you said in that other quote, it's usually accompanied by the idea of some kind of self-regulation.
Yeah.
That like there's something that you need to do as an individual subject to tame your particular type of, pluralistic identity. And so, she says the invisible hand of the market is the showcase example of this.
And can I just say very briefly that the little subheading here that we're about to discuss is probably my favorite chapter or subsection title I've ever seen in a book, and it is called The Invisible Hand Job of the Market.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that's...
This is why Zupancic is bae.
Yeah. With the anti-sexist thing in that chapter, she's kind of saying, well, sexuality is supposedly problematic because it's involving an other who is sort of unreliable or unpredictable, but it is simultaneously sex that stands in the way of good social relations, right? So it's both the thing that causes the problem of social relations, but also the thing that you can't achieve that could alleviate, could cause your good social relations or alleviate the bad ones, right? So similarly, humanity cannot flourish because it is in bondage, but it is human nature that stands in the way of emancipation. We can't be free politically, right? Because we have rules and whatever, but it's specifically our nature that causes there to be rules. So it's also the thing that stands in the way of our emancipation, right? So she says, if enjoyment is what disturbs the relation, it does not come between what it disturbs. Rather, it implicates or places those elements within the heart of one another. So it's kind of like a little swapsy,
Technical terminology here on Real Philosophy Hours.
Yeah, guys.
Little swapsies.
I hope that you're following the little swapsy. I've got a quote here.
What page, John?
On page 30.
Okay.
And she said, this then is the double paradox that we're trying to formulate. If we remove the other from enjoyment, we find the other at the very heart of the most auto-focused masturbatory enjoyment. On the other hand, if we remove enjoyment from the other, we find enjoyment at the very heart of the most spiritual bond with the other. So once again, we're always at a distance from that enjoyment, or from that other, right? The other and enjoyment are extimately related. This is why, in order to remove enjoyment from the other, a second operation is immediately called for, that of removing the other from enjoyment itself. These two elements imply each other, each carries the other in itself, and this is what twists what may look like a symmetry or a relation in a way that resembles some of Escher's drawings of impossible objects. So it's
like the hands drawing
the
themselves.
hands drawing each other themselves.
Yeah.
Then we get into the invisible hand job of the market, which is the next chapter there. Just to summarize, right? Like this is starting to get real complicated. Now we're talking about interrelatedness of the other and enjoyment, and we're talking about how the social totality is kind of a manufactured totality, and what we're really experiencing is like some fundamental absence at the heart of freedom or at the heart of the social body that should be our cause for relationality and emancipation, but rather is papered over once again by this like neutral political plurality that democracy deals with in this perfect kind of way that's like perfectly representative and everybody's happy, right? Because Trump.
So let me ask you, because we talked about this on past Real Philosophy Hours episodes, the idea that sort of what we're striving for with a sort of revolutionary like leftist political project, sometimes it gets, I think this is especially the case in Badiou, is that, like if we were to achieve communism, that would in itself be achieving democracy fully for the first time. And I get the sense that for Zupancic, she's actually trying to problematize the idea of democracy ever being able to function in this way, precisely because it falls prey to this sort of papering over, even if it's in a sort of more radical leftist political approach. The idea that democracy would be this thing that isn't inherently antagonistic or sort of is neutered, like that in itself is also to like try to paper over the antagonism.
Yeah, exactly. And then she also goes on to say how capitalism is something that is trying to exploit this point of negativity as well, namely through the worker as a commodity. Okay, and that's what she's talking about in this chapter, the invisible handjob of the market. I'm just going to say that as often as I possibly can.
I am too.
I really
so
like it.
Also in the section, the invisible handjob of the market, I actually, do you mind if I read a quick quote?
Yeah,
It's just a couple of lines, but I really love it.
What page are you on?
31, near the bottom.
Okay.
What is the fundamental quote-unquote discovery of capitalism? That non-relation is profitable, and that is the ultimate source of growth and profit. And with this came the idea that, this being so, there is no reason why everybody couldn't profit from it. This is how we get the narrative of a new, higher relation with a capital R. the foundational myth of modern capitalism known as the invisible hand of the market. So again, the idea of this like non-relation is something that you can profit off of, and sort of inherently also comes on with this second consequence, which is this sort of like higher order relation, and that is called the invisible hand of the market. But Zupancic is basically going to say that it's actually more like getting a hand job from the invisible hand of the market. Yeah,
I like the way that she frames it. She says, by extension of that logic that you're using, the capitalists are making themselves enriched. Right, through the worker as a commodity, right? And in the same way that someone might make themselves seen or to masturbate oneself. Yeah. You know, you might think of it in that sense. And to make oneself seen is specifically to remove the other from the opposition of seeing and being seen. To make oneself seen is to just take it upon yourself that the other isn't there and that you're the one that is projecting yourself from your own perspective, I guess. I don't know, that's like maybe complicated, but this is the relational aspect of capitalism that drives exploitation, that drives, you know, sort of like this capitalist productivity is specifically the capitalists making themselves enriched by commodifying the workers.
And she says right before that too, really quick, she says, what capital exploits is the point of negativity or the entropy of the social order, with the workers situated at this precise point. Capitalists are not so much stealing from the workers as employing them to make the negativity, entropy of the system work for them, the capitalists. Right. Or in other words, they are making themselves enriched.
Right. We are like as the workers, we are like the exhaust pipes of this like machine that is exploiting us and using us as its point of negativity to like circle around, basically. And she also talks about how, so like likewise, to make oneself enriched, similar to removing the other, like when you're making oneself seen, removing the other from the opposition of seeing and being seen. To make oneself enriched is to remove the worker from the opposition between the source of value and the substance of value. So in capitalism, the worker doesn't exist. Any worker that does is necessarily a slave, right? The proletariat is not simply one of the social classes, but rather it's the name of the constitutive negativity in capitalism. So you can see the emancipatory potential here in this logic, right? And the reason that she emphasizes this so much is because it's extremely productive. Like when you start to understand subject as something that is radically untamed by the social order, that is like radically at the heart of all problems, and sex as the thing that sort of founds that, you can extend this logic to things like capital. And then all of a sudden you start to see the implementation of all of these ideas, right? Like, you know, these Marxist ideas talking about how we need to like have these means of production so that we can not be in the place where we are made invisible, or in the place where we are fully exploited by just being othered by capital. Yeah. Right.
And I think that's what's so radical. And I'm really glad you made that connection, is to say that what we're doing is sort of taking a step back to something much more fundamental, the idea of sex and like subjectivity, and then using the logic and the implications of that argument to then extend into the realm of the political and the economic, which gives us a new way to sort of radically understand what it is about like capital and like how to understand it and criticize it. So I want to just tag this quote on too, because I found this really important. She says, this also shows how the usual humanist complaints about how in capitalism, quote unquote, we are all just commodities, miss the point.
I have this underlined.
Yeah, if we were indeed just commodities, capitalism would not work. Right. We need to be free persons selling our labor, power as our property, our commodity. Yep. And that's whenever she goes into the idea of like the worker doesn't exist.
Hot motherfucking fire.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. A little bit spicy, a little bit icy motherfucking cold. Yes. From Bay.
Yes. This is why Zupancic is Bay.
Exactly.
Once again, it's not that the proletarian is just a social class. Yeah. Right? It is a point of negativity that absolutely must be employed to sort of pave the way for some form of emancipation from capitalist exploitation.
And again, like what you keep hitting on too is so important. It's like it's precisely in the realm of the subject as sort of disrupted or disoriented or fractured in this particular way that gives the possibility of achieving a type of universal that is like dehumanized in this particular way, because it's from a point of negativity and not one of positivity, and being able to say, oh, being human is this, being a worker is this, being a sexual being is this.
Right. And in this kind of sense, it's interesting, right? Because capitalism dehumanizes us, right? But the solution to the dehumanization is not that we be given our human nature back or be given our humanization back, right? It's almost the opposite. Like we need to go fully into dehumanization so that we can access the pathway that capital revolves around through us in order to create the situation of exploitation that we're in. We have to be fully dehumanized. We have to accept our status as dehumanized before we can move in a direction away from that capitalist exploitation, right? Don't settle for just being given 57 fucking genders, right? Like, that's not the solution for like our dehumanization, right? Like, there's something in subject that needs to be represented as impossible to represent, right? And not just represented, right? So I don't know. This just gets like layers upon layers, but yeah.
Real philosophy hours. And the
turtles.
other thing, though, I would say, though, I think what you're kind of describing that we would use different language for in other episodes is that the idea isn't to sort of like negate, but it's to negate the negation.
Yeah.
Right? It's the dialectical reversal to say, no, it is precisely through the dehumanization that capital offers us that we do then sort of have this sort of opening up of this other kind of possibility of achieving a universal, like, emancipatory kind of position.
Yep.
Or subjectivity, or some combination of both.
All right.
Damn.
Well,
that's
put that in your goddamn taco and chomp that bitch.
tacos.
Tacos. So,
That's just up to chapter 2.
yeah, that was chapter 2. Moving on.
Also,
to chapter
just to say again, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Read Zupancic. She is incredible.
Yeah, this is great. I'm glad I'm doing this with you, comrade. This is what this show was made for.
I absolutely agree. This is, to me, this is the whole point of starting the show, is to do books like this.
Hell yeah. All right, so chapter 3 is called Contradictions That Matter. Here we go. This is what we were just talking about, right?
Yep.
Sex or gender. That's the first section in this chapter, right? And so here we go once again, right? Morality is not simply a controversy, but an epistemological problem or limit. It attempts to ontologize sexuality and reduce it to a cultural problem and not the abstract foundational problematic that it is. And it is no coincidence that the discourse of sexual difference sounds like high mathematics and psychoanalysis. This is where she starts talking about feminism. Ultimately, what we're dealing with here is, this question about where should we fall? Should we be on the side of gender? Should we be on the side of sex? Right? And obviously, being that we've said all of what we said about this book so far, she's going to argue real strongly that the feminist struggle is gravely situated in the idea of sex and not gender. She's basically making the point that the feminist struggle mirrors the inconsistency in ontology, in the sense that the domain of the woman in concept is constantly reaffirmed to plaster over its true subversive quality. People always emphasize the feminine, not to represent it in its true subversiveness, but to sort of presented as a complement to masculinity. The guiding hand of masculinity is like impulsiveness, right? It's always this like stupid mythos of like the woman, rather than how it could truly be subversive, right? So rather than the supplemental category to man, which can be filled in with whatever hot issue, to highlight the things that are excluded in our society, feminism should refer to the much more radical fissure in the very homogeneity of the society itself. This is what makes discussions of sex political and not simply cultural. They invoke the radical impossibility of the homogeneous society, right? And they open up the space of the social. But gender and its idea neutralize this fissure and just reassert femininity as like one of the possible permutations of the sexual identity. And it just makes it into a positive domain and fully just kills and neuters it. And this is where we can maybe bring in this Copjec quote, which is on page 37.
Is this the block quote in the middle?
Yeah. Here it just says, goat. Copjec is the goat.
Copjec is goat.
Yeah.
Zupancic is bae.
Yeah, exactly.
I will tell you.
Do you want to read it?
I have this bracketed, and then I just have a large exclamation point.
Yeah.
Okay, so this quote is from Joan Copjec from a piece called The Sexual Compact. The psychoanalytic category of sexual difference was from this date, the mid-1980s, deemed suspect and largely forsaken in favor of the neutered category of gender. Yes, neutered. I insist on this because it is specifically the sex of sexual difference that dropped out when this term was replaced by gender. Gender theory performed one major feat. It removed the sex from sex. While gender theorists continued to speak of sexual practices, they ceased to question what sex or sexuality is. In brief, sex was no longer the subject of an ontological inquiry and reverted instead to being what it was in common parlance. Some vague sort of distinction, but basically a secondary characteristic when it was applied to the subject, a qualifier added to others, or, when applied to an act, something a bit naughty.
Yeah.
Goat status.
Yeah. Goat. Copjec is goat. Anyway, so it goes on to say basically like, if we want to avoid this, the crucial question becomes, what exactly does the insistence on sex and sexual difference as the subject of ontology, of ontological inquiry amount to? And it's what we've been saying this whole time. The category of the sexual is properly subversive only when it is seen as like an extimate core to being, right? Like it cannot be neutralized and just included into the positive ontology of like what exists out there, right? It is specifically a category that resists that positivization and needs to remain negative in order to have its potential influence, right? And so she goes on from this idea of like arguing about feminism and sex to just fucking ripping Young a new asshole.
Which we're always in favor of.
Which, yeah, fuck Young. Oh, and then she goes on to start talking about the ontology of science as well. That science is also guilty of the same kind of neutralization or the desexualization of reality and philosophy itself.
Can we just touch on one quick thing before
Sure.
we jump into that?
Yeah.
I just want to say too, because this is on page 38, but I found this a really helpful sort of unpacking of that Copjec quote. So one of the things that she mentions is that, you know, a lot of time in feminist studies and gender studies, they really, and it's obvious why they do this, they sort of are highly, highly critical of a lot of discussions about sexuality. But the reason why they are is because they've almost done this fundamental mistake, which is they've like taken their enemy at their word, which is to say, oh, okay, well, if we take sexuality as it's discussed on the basis of like biological essentialism, then we're going to sort of basically like deny or negate sexuality as being part of our discussion. But I think Zupancic and Copjec are really trying to say is that that's to take this sort of like socially normative idea of sexuality, and it totally closes off the possibility of understanding sexuality in this much more disruptive, like traumatic core that is more part of Lacanian psychoanalysis. And to me, that's a really, really important thing to understand how we encounter these discourses now. Yep. So again, it's just a fundamentally different approach to take to what sexuality is, and it's usually not one that we encounter because we're all used to the idea of, oh, sexuality is to talk about biological essentialism, like it's fucking a Ben Shapiro video or some bullshit like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we're just fucking talking about the dragons and the fucking, you know, feminine sexuality of Jordan Peterson, right? So,
which we are not doing.
Which we are not doing.
Yeah. So anyway, science is also guilty of this.
Yeah,
bullshit.
right. Science does the same shit, right?
Science is canceled.
Canceling science, guys. No. Later on, she goes on to redeem science in a Lacanian sense. It's not that we are saying science is something that we can just deny and dismiss offhand. In fact, science has an extremely privileged position in Lacanian theory, and I think later we'll get to why that is. But as of right now, she talks about how, in general, science is shying away from discussing the question of ontology as such, right? And psychoanalysis, far from lamenting this, right, sees itself as strictly coextensive with the move of desexualization. Right? Not something that will reinvigorate the universe's sexuality. Rather, something that relegates sex to the real, not substance. The desexualization that science is presenting, right, is something that psychoanalysis is like kind of akin to, but kind of takes to a different level of extremity, right?
Yeah.
You know, also emphasizing that the sexual is strictly irreducible. There isn't any necessarily contradiction between the positions of psychoanalysis and science, right? But there's also no coincidence between them. What is referred to as natural is the sedimentation of the discursive. So the division between nature and culture becomes internal to culture dialectically. She goes on to talk about how Judith Butler kind of captures this distinction, right? When she's talking about performativity versus expression, right? She says, kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but the real, right, capital R, real, is something parasitic on performative productivity. The signifier not only produces the symbolic reality, words,
lots of words there.
Follow. It also produces the dimension related to the points of structural impossibility and contradiction inherent to the symbolic reality itself. This real capital R real, is the space of the vital out of jointedness with the symbolic. Libido, jouissance, the drive, the sexualized body, right? All of those things fall into this sort of category of the real and the sexual.
Can I clarify one thing for listeners
Sure.
really fast?
I feel like that probably, I went really fast through that. So.
Yeah, and it's also, it's a lot of very complicated arguments that she's engaging with. But for anyone that hasn't encountered this idea of performativity in Judith Butler, we're going to do an episode on Butler at some point. But just to know that very simply, the idea is that what is driving or sort of the core feature of gender as we think about it typically is not driven by sort of you're expressing some inherent essence, some sort of like metaphysical truth. The idea is that the actions that you are engaged in create the idea that there is a core essential feature. So it's more about the actions and the performance that create your sort of category of gender versus the category creates the actions. So just for anyone that hasn't encountered that concept of performativity, it's an important one. It has a lot of significance in terms of theory and leftist theory around gender, but that's just a brief idea of what that is actually talking about.
Yeah, and I really like what she goes on to say too, because she's basically relating this idea of like the space of the real that is sort of generated by this performativity, like in Butler. Mm-hmm. She relates it to Marx. This is a quote from 41. Class antagonism is not simply conflict between different classes, but the very principle of the constitution of class society. Antagonism as such never simply exists between conflicting parties. It is the very structuring principle of this conflict and of the elements involved in it. So she's privileging class antagonism not as just like some category of conflict or, something that exists between two classes. Rather, it's a structuring element. This is something that defines class.
So it's like classes themselves are defined precisely by the antagonism.
Yes.
And not the other way around where it's you have these two coherent classes that then become antagonistic towards each other.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a quote, let's see, top of 43. The messiness of our sexuality. This is, she's going to get to Copjec here in a second, but this is kind of introducing what she says, what Copjec says. The messiness of our sexuality is not a consequence or result of there being no sexual relation. It's not that our sexuality is messy because it's without a clear signifying rule. It emerges only from and at the place of this lack and attempts to deal with it. Sexuality is not ravaged by or disturbed because of a gap cutting deep into its tissues. It is rather the messy sewing up of this gap, right? So what we talk about when we talk about sexuality is like some kind of messy suture that is trying to contain this impossibility or this persistence of a gap in meaning or in the real.
And just to clarify this, so earlier we were saying that it would be a mistake to just like accept the impossibility and move on. Sexuality inherently is not the impossibility. It's the messy relational sewing up of the gap itself.
Yeah.
So, and that's where the dialectical kind of piece comes in. It's the impossibility and the like positive relational thing that somehow emerges out of that as well.
Right. And Lacan's attempt to sort of break down the thing that happens in the place of this sort of messy suturing, right, is what she was kind of referring to with what appears as like high mathematics in sexual theory and psychoanalysis, right? It's kind of like these strange formulas of sexuation that Lacan comes up with to sort of try to differentiate between what is masculine and what is feminine and the different types of relation that those things are, right? But before we get to that, which will come here in a little bit, I want to read this Copjec quote at the bottom of 43. Because she's GOAT. This is Copjec quoted. When we speak of language's failure with respect to sex, we speak not of its falling short of a prediscursive object, but of its falling into contradiction with itself. Sex coincides with this failure, this inevitable contradiction. Sex is then the impossibility of completing meaning, not, as Butler's historicist or deconstructionalist argument would have it, a meaning that is incomplete or unstable, or the point is that sex is the structural incompleteness of language, not that sex is itself incomplete. Once again, sex is the contradiction itself, not sex is incomplete in itself.
Yeah.
So just a kind of a hairy distinction there. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. But once again, you can't just put impossibility in the place of the gap and say it's covered.
Yeah, and I think the sort of implications of what seems like we might be splitting hairs here, playing word games, the implications of the different way to read those are huge. And they have really severe implications for radical politics. Again, because if you extend this sort of basic fundamental logic out, this is going to shape how you're going to answer questions about class struggle, questions about democracy and what are we looking for when we talk about like what is democracy, right? And so again, it's just important to understand that, you know, the theoretical sort of nuances here have like really, really concrete implications to how you think about the basic like categories of gender and sex or democracy or class struggle or, you know, dare we say communism or socialism or revolution, right?
Yeah. I'm just going to read one last quote from this section and then we can move on to the next chapter or the next section. Just to summarize, right? The desexualization of ontology, that is, ontology no longer being conceived as a combinatory of two masculine and feminine principles. The desexualization of ontology coincides precisely with the sexual appearing as the real / the disruptive point of being. That's why if one removes sex from sex, right, like Copjec is saying, you know, this idea of gender is doing, one removes the very thing that has brought to light the problem that sexual difference is all about. One does not remove the problem per se, but just the means of seeing the problem and taking it in its own context, right, and seeing the way it operates. So by resorting to this like gender idea, what we're doing is we're taking away the language of unfreedom that we have to describe what type of situation we actually find ourselves in, right? We're neutralizing or neutering ourselves, not in effect solving the problem, but rather obscuring or obfuscating it completely to where it no longer even appears anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? And that is just compounding the problem, not a solution. So anyway.
That is such hot fire. There it is, the cream, rising to the top, as patron saint of the show, Macho Man Randy Savage would once say. We hope you really enjoyed this one, and you know what? I hope this one was really challenging. I hope it was really, really dense and complicated and made you think and maybe caused you to disagree. You know, the Lacanians, they got some pretty controversial theoretical viewpoints on a lot of things. And you know what? Even if you didn't agree with some of Zupancic's theoretical conclusions, her analytical barbs that she's just firing off left and right throughout this book, at least it made you think. You know, that's the whole dialectical idea. You gotta actually be in opposition to something to then generate the synthesis, to negate the negation, right? So we hope your negation got all sorts of negated in this one. We're going to see you back here in a few weeks for part 2. No spoilers, but we're going to keep diving into this thing. Again, this book is very dense, very complex, despite its very, very short length. But as Comrade Commissar Alex said in this episode, you know, this kind of book is exactly why we made this show. This is sort of where we get to shine. Our format, our approach, our perspective, our style, I think tends to really provide an excellent way to dig into these very, very complicated theoretical texts. And that's exactly why we have real late night philosophy hours on Red Library. All right, y'all, in the midst of all this coronavirus, pandemical, apocalyptic, nightmarish nonsense, we just want to say we love y'all. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Thanks for listening. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, so go over and show some love to our podrads over at the Regrettable Century and From 78 as well. And we'll sign off the way that we always do. Stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated, attempt to become emancipated, find those lost futures, find each other, connect as much as you can with all this social distancing going on. And remember, as always, your comrades over here at Red Library, we out here. We thinking about you. We're trying to hold it down for ourselves and for all of y'all out there, at least keeping you entertained for a couple of hours a week. Hit us up. Don't be strangers. And until the next time, Red Library is out of here. Peace.